And we're recording. It's the Rob Kall Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is Cyndi O'Meara. She's a nutritionist, filmmaker. She's created the documentary What's with Wheat, which is on Netflix now. And God, I recommend that you watch it. It's a powerful documentary, and it's really affected me for sure. She's also a best-selling author, international speaker, and founder of changinghabits.com/au.
Oh, it's .au.
Oh,
no slash.
.au. And I thought I was doing it better. So we did this interview last week, and there was a problem with it, and it broke up, and the second part of it worked fine. So we've got 40 minutes that are good, but the beginning of it got lost. So we're redoing that part of the interview, which is basically the introduction and the overview. So my first question before was, why'd you get into this?
Why did I get into this? If I take it back to the way I was brought up by an Iowan mother who cooked everything from scratch, did everything the way she, that we used to do it back in the 60s and 70s. And I had a father who was a pharmacist, believe it or not, who then became a chiropractor. But if I go back a little bit further, my mum was the oldest of 11 children in Iowa to a corn farming family. And 7 brothers she had, and 6 of them had a disease called hemophilia. So, there was a lot of there was a lot of information out there back then about hemophilia. But what was really interesting is that my mum was born in 1937 when there was arsenic and lead being sprayed on the cornfields and the wheat fields due to a locust plague. And that was 1938 and 1939. Then by, I think it was 1945, DDT started to be sprayed. So I look at that family, Rob, and that family had so much disease. So first of all, there was hemophilia and HIV and AIDS due to the blood transfusions. There was 2 of them had breast cancer. There was type 1 diabetes. There was dysphagia. There was many diseases that this family had. And I think what my mum did was it was like, well, I'm not going to have my family end up like that. So she basically fed us the best that we could eat. My dad, being from pharmacy to chiropractic, didn't give us any medications, but gave us adjustments all the time. We never went to a medical doctor. I don't ever remember going to a doctor. And we were brought up really healthy. And I guess I decided that I was going to do the same thing. Well, if there were all these genetic factors there, what did I need to do in order to keep myself healthy as well as my children healthy? And so I learned the art of prevention. And I ate the best that I could eat. I made everything from scratch. I made all my own breads, my muffins, my cakes. All our meat and our vegetables were back in those days, we didn't call them organic. It was just, you got...
Everybody ate just, well, yeah. I guess not, because there was all that toxic spray DDT on there, But
nobody was talking about that. That wasn't somebody, no one was saying it except maybe...
How did you even get it? How did you get food that you knew didn't have DDT sprayed on it when there was no organic label?
We lived in country Victoria, Australia. We bought from farmers. We knew what they sprayed. My mum was very much into that. But, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which came out in the 1960s, was probably the first thing that came out talking about, what are these chemicals doing to our water supply, to our food supply, to our animals, to us as humans. So, that was the 1960s, but I felt that my mum and dad were way ahead of that. And then I carried that on. I just carried that on. I learned all of this stuff. I went to and did nutrition. I am a nutritionist. I did 6 years of university in order to understand what I needed to do and to teach other people. So I was doing really well. My health was great until I hit my late 40s. And now you can say this is old age, but I wasn't going to take that. So I decided that there was something that I was consuming that I was not feeling good with. So, and because I'm a nutritionist, I guess I'm going to point to food, aren't I? So at this point, by my late 40s, I had gained weight, still eating the same foods I'd always eaten. I was having anxiety. I had a very bad bad back, lower back pain. My husband was a chiropractor, my father was a chiropractor, my sister was a chiropractor, but nothing would relieve the back pain. I had a really sore right hip that when I would get up, it would be so painful that I was thinking, I'm going to have a hip operation the way things are going. I'm sitting here cross-legged at the moment, and I do not have that pain. And this is 6 years later on after doing the elimination. So I had all these things happening in my body that wasn't right. Dry skin, dry hair, dry everything. And it was just, I decided the elimination was the only way to go. So I went on just meat, chicken or fish, very little food, green vegetables, a few pieces of fruit. And I did that for 3 weeks. And over a 3-week period, I lost all the weight I'd gained over that 2 years. All my aches and pains disappeared. Unbelievable clarity of mind. I felt like I was on another planet. It was like someone had turned a light on for me. And everything just was feeling amazing. I was energetic, no more hip pain, became more flexible in my yoga, all in 3 weeks. So then I can't live on just that because I like to go out and I love to do things. So I changed back to my reintroducing foods back into the diet. And when I reintroduced wheat, everything came back. I gained, probably 1.8 pound in weight overnight, which is not fat, it's water weight, which tells me I'm inflamed. My sore back came back, my brain just went to sludge, and I just thought, well, what's wrong with wheat? And so I went on a bit of a research and decided to figure out, well, what is wrong with wheat? Because I had done anthropology in my first year at university, and I knew that grain for the hunter-gatherer was really important, going to the agricultural revolution. So I was a little bit perplexed. And when I started to find out what was wrong with wheat, my husband said to me, well, are you going to write another book? And I went, no, I think I would like to do something different. He said, well, why don't you do a documentary? And he gave me a budget, and 2 years later, that documentary was made, which is What's with Wheat. So there's the story.
And What's with Wheat, the documentary, is on Netflix now. Now, when
yes.
I went to look for it, I had a little trouble finding it, and I had it because they don't let you use the apostrophe as in what with what's. So you just WHATS space with, and it'll come up.
Yeah. And you know what? I'd love a review on there, because what I'm noticing is that I'm noticing the reviews either range from 1 or to 5. And the ones are obviously farmers or people that, I don't know, they just don't want to hear that what has happened to wheat. They're not wanting to hear it. And so they find every excuse about the movie. But the 5s are the ones that go, this information should have been out years ago. This is vital information that we need to know, because the story of wheat is the story of food. And if we just start as a population saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're not putting up with the chemical spraying. We're not putting up with the seeds and everything else that's done to wheat, from, refinement to adding of vitamins and minerals that are synthetic or mined. So I think, if we're going to be blind to this and we're not going to listen to this, then we're going to be blind to the rest of our food, and we'll end up with lifestyle diseases, because that's what's causing our lifestyle diseases, is our lifestyle. That's why they're called lifestyle diseases, and food is a big part of that.
Absolutely. So I want to go through a couple questions. First of all, you start off the documentary talking about kind of the anthropology. You show a picture of wheat from an Egyptian piece of art, and we've had this conversation once, and it's fascinating. You basically tell us the history and prehistory of wheat and grain agriculture.
Yes. So look, there's a knowledge that we have had wheat on the landscape in northern European countries. We've had wheat on the landscape probably for 23,000 years. So they've dated back the first wheat to a wheat that they call einkorn. And the reason they know it's the first wheat is it's a monoploid. And a monoploid, if you look at how grain hybridizes itself in nature, it actually will cross with another grain, or another grass, I should say, and that becomes a diploid. And then from a diploid, it doubles again and doubles again. So if we have a look at our modern wheat is called a polyploid because of the amount of chromosomes that it has. So we know definitely the first wheat was 23,000 years ago. So there's a possibility that we used the seed of that grass, which was called einkorn, in order to make a slurry, or even it might have been the beginning of us making bread. But when we have a look at our southern hemisphere and we look at the Australian landscape, there were many grains that naturally were in the southern landscape, in Australia particularly. And Australia is noted to be the oldest bread makers or agricultural revolution. And there's a belief that the Australian Aboriginal people took it back at least 60,000 years, if not above. And I have heard in this wonderful book called Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, who read the explorers, I guess, all their diaries, and realised that the Australian Aboriginal people were not hunter-gatherers, they were agriculturalists, but they were peaceful agriculturalists. And his belief is it could go back as far as 110,000 years ago that they were using grain. But they knew how to cook the grain. They knew how to prepare it. They knew that it had obviously some, oxalates or toxins or something in it that would cause them to be sick if it wasn't prepared properly. The Northern Hemisphere people also knew this. We would, if we used grain, we would use it in a slurry where it was cooked, or it would be used to bake bread. So it would have... we would make a sourdough out of it. And that sourdough, to prepare that, would take 3, 4 to 10 days.
Let me just jump in there a second, because
yes,
I know there's another kind of food that has the same property, manioc. Manioc, if you don't prepare it properly, has a slow poison in it that will kill people. Now, you just described something like that for wheat. Is that all wheat?
Well, that's all grain. Grain, like seeds, protect themselves because they want to reproduce. So they have things that protect themselves from being eaten by either humans or eaten by anything that's on the planet that will eat it. So they have a protective layer or protective, not nutrients, but like lectin. Lectin is one of the proteins in there. Gluten is another protein in there that we have to break down in order for our body to digest it, because one of the properties of gluten, when it's broken down, it breaks down into something called gliadin. Gliadin tells us if somebody has an antibody to gliadin, we know they have celiac disease, because gliadin plus bacteria that are parasitic to us or are not good for us or pathological to us will open the cell wall of our gut. They're the only two things that open it, and it's through a mechanism where another protein called zonulin is used. So gliadin is obviously something that will cause us health issues if it's not broken down. So, and that's for many foods. People don't realize that there are many foods, like legumes have those lectins as well. That's why Indians who have eaten it for thousands of generations have cooked it. And that, what about rice? You know, the Asians have cooked rice for thousands of generations. But let's go back to the Australian Aboriginal. So the Australian Aboriginal people, yes.
The way that they prepare it eliminates the toxic aspects of the grain?
That's right.
And that's not done in today's world for most breads, right?
No.
Is there a way to know, is that it's described, that is on the labeling, that one would know that the bread has been properly prepared? I know you mentioned sourdough.
Yes. So there are probably 95% of bread bakers out there usually get a premix. They add water to it, bit of yeast, rise it in an hour, and then it basically goes straight to, to be cooked, and then you eat it. So it's a couple of hours. But there are these artisan bakers out there, And you just have to find them, or you make your own. You know, it's not that hard. That's the thing is that most people think that it's really hard to do this stuff, but it's actually not hard. And there are many recipes on the net about it. But there in Australia, I know for sure there are artisan bakers. And when I travel throughout the world, I find artisan bakers everywhere. So they're the old-fashioned bakers that are doing it the way we used to do it. Yes, it's laborious, but it's more expensive.
Of course, everything healthy is.
Yeah.
How do you do a Google search for an artisan baker who is making the kind of bread that you would like to see people eating?
Well, sorry, I missed that question.
How would you do a Google search?
Oh.
Artisan bread makers or brands of bread that would meet your criteria?
Yeah, well, I would look up einkorn flour or emmer wheat flour, and I would plug in something like emmer wheat artisan bread, you know, something like that. But I know I've seen them in New York. I know that there are people growing these grains, which are our monoploids and our diploids, our very old wheats. I know they're growing them in this country. They grow them in Australia, they grow them in Europe, they grow them in England, but you have to ask for it. You've got to ask for these flours. So you will know when you find a bread baker that is doing it. It won't look like and it won't smell like the ones, you know, the franchises that you see. It will be very different. And, you know, you just have to do a search on it. And hopefully there's someone in that is there. But if you want to make it yourself, just look up traditional sourdough breads recipe.
Traditional sourdough bread.
Or how do I make a sourdough starter? That's another one, which is just flour and water. Like I can tell everybody now, it's just flour and water. You mix it up into a slurry. You leave it on the bench with a tea towel over it. And every day you just kind of mix it up and you'll notice it starts to bubble. And after about, 8 to 10 days, you can add all your other ingredients. So you add your more flour and your oils and your salts, and then you let it rise again, punch it down, rise again, and then it's ready to bake. That way the bacteria has broken down the gluten and the protein and the lectins and everything else that is a bother to the human digestive system.
No, that's interesting because we have billions of gut bacteria that help us to digest, but you're basically saying that for bread to be digestible, we have to let the bacteria help digest it before it goes into our stuff, before we cook it.
And that is a really good point. The problem with our gut bacteria is being eroded, and it has been eroded probably since the 1930s when we started to spray chemicals on, especially lead and arsenic. We started to spray these chemicals on our lands, but more so when we started to spray DDT after the Second World War. So the people who were making chemicals for the war started to make chemicals for our agriculture. So DDT is a neurotoxin. We also now spray something called glyphosate. Glyphosate is
Monsanto's Roundup.
Roundup, exactly. It's an antibiotic to the soil bacteria. It's an antibiotic to our bacteria in our gut. We also have been eating a refined diet that doesn't feed our bacteria. We also take more antibiotics than we should. We take things called PPIs or antacids, which stop the acid in our stomach from being produced or neutralizes the acid, which then allows parasitic bacteria to get to our bacteria, which then becomes a war to our good bacteria, and we are overtaken by our bad bacteria. So there are many reasons why our microbiome is slowly being eroded, and it's generational as well. But I think the most insidious is the Roundup. That, to me, is the most insidious of all, because we don't even know we're eating it, because it's sprayed everywhere. It's sprayed between rows of beautiful fruits and vegetables. It's sprayed as a desiccant on canola oil. It's also sprayed as a desiccant on wheat 3 weeks before harvest. Not all, but it is sprayed. So how do we know?
This is in the second half of the interview that we already recorded.
Right. Yes.
What was really interesting to me is that Roundup, glyphosate, Monsanto's monster product, is used on all kinds of non-GMO foods.
Yeah.
So if you look at a food and it has the label that says non-GMO, that doesn't mean that it hasn't been sprayed with Roundup or glyphosate.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah. So I want to move on though, because we do cover.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
The interview. What we haven't talked about is really all the ways that wheat is making people sick.
Yeah.
If we talk about the neurological part, so we'll hold off on that. But you basically say in the movie that there's an epidemic of wheat problems.
Yeah. What people don't realize is that once you compromise your gut lining, which gliadin does, which is part of gluten, and if you haven't prepared the grain properly, and if you haven't, and your microbiome is eroded, then there are so many things that can go wrong. So we know that celiac disease is one of them. You know, that's been identified. That if you have celiac disease, stay off wheat or any gluten, and you will, you will regenerate. Your digestive system will regenerate.
Wait, you say wheat or any gluten? I thought gluten came from wheat.
Wheat and any gluten. So gluten can also come, there's so much gluten out there, but the three grains that have wheat are have gluten are rye and wheat and barley. So they're the three grains that have gluten.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people say oats, but it's usually because oats are contaminated because they're transported in the same transport trucks. They're in the same silos, and so there is a contamination of oats with gluten. But I do notice that there's a company called Red Mill here in the US, and they actually do gluten-free oats where nothing is contaminated. So we have to also realize that many of our foods are contaminated with wheat products that may have some gluten in them.
By the way, I just want to, Red Mill is an amazing company. The owner gave the company to his employees. It's an employee-owned company.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I love their, I go into Whole Foods or, no, I don't see them in Trader Joe's anymore, but I go into Whole Foods and I see this amazing array of beautiful grains and organic, or, the fact that they've got the gluten-free oats now. And so it's good. They're really doing a good job. Yeah. But they must be prepared properly. This is the issue, is that they must be prepared properly. They must be soaked and they must be cooked. Because if they're eaten raw, they still have the lectins. They will have other anti-nutrient properties. That's why we've always made a slurry or cooked bread with it. We've never ever done it any different.
So I eat organic version of Cheerios that I get from Trader Joe's, and I eat organic whole oatmeal. Does that work? Or?
Well, let's look at Cheerios. So that's a breakfast cereal. I don't know what the difference is between an organic Cheerio and a Cheerio, except maybe they're using organic ingredients. But the problem is it's still a refined grain. It's not cooked as well as it's not prepared properly. Because they take out the germ, because they take out the germ and they take out the bran, they then add back all these other ingredients. What you could do is go to the kitchen, get your Cheerios out, have a read at the ingredients, have a look at the vitamins and minerals they add to it. If they've added folic acid to it and you have the MTHFR gene, you can't even use that folic acid. It's a waste of time, because it's a synthetic folic acid and you can't convert it to methylated folate. If it's got B1 in it, that's made from the petrochemical industry. If it's got iron in it, you could grind it and pull it out with a magnet. You can grind your Cheerios and pull it out with a magnet, the iron. So, it's not what you think. I would rather see you do your porridge, do your oats, cook your oats. Yeah. And cook them well, soak them overnight and cook them, cook them in the morning. And that's one way of really helping you digest those oats.
And before getting turned on to your movie and your message, I've been buying this heritage grain breakfast cereal as well, which is made from the old grains.
Yes.
But I don't know if it's prepared either. It's not, so that's clearly, it's not enough just to be made from anything. It has to be prepared properly. You got to cook it yourself, it sounds like.
Look, you do. I don't have, I never have had breakfast cereals because I knew how they were made. I don't trust long life foods unless it's been dried the old-fashioned way. I really don't trust long life foods or fermented the proper way. So yes, everybody's probably going, but I have time for this, Cyndi. Well, you need to make time, because if you don't make time, then you're going to have to make a lot of time later for illness.
Yeah, and let's get back to the illness. So you mentioned the leaky gut, which is caused by the glutens and the bacterial problems.
Yeah.
There are also autoimmune conditions.
Yes.
Not them.
So there's not just, so all right, so we talked about gluten being a problem if you have celiac disease. Then there's wheat allergies. So people know to stay away from wheat if they have an allergy. Then there's one called non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It doesn't seem to have an autoimmune diagnosis, but you know when you eat wheat that you feel foggy in the brain, you got aches and pains, you bloated stomach, you know, you've had celiac disease you don't have, wheat allergy you don't have, you have no autoimmune disease, but you still feel crappy when you eat wheat. And the only way you can figure out whether you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, because we really don't have specific tests, although Alessio Fasano is working on a test for it, is to eliminate wheat from the diet. And that's why I've given you the 6-week no wheat, is so you can eliminate it and give it a go. See how you feel.
Well,
you know,
talk about that. You've given, what is this 6 weeks no wheat program?
So number one, it's an education program. That's number one. It educates you about wheat, where it is, the foods it's in, because there are some things you'll look at and you go, oh, I don't see wheat in it, but we give you the names of everything that has that could be wheat and could have gluten in it. So and then we give you recipes to help you get through 6 weeks no wheat, but enjoy your food and not just give up food, but enter more foods into your diet. And we just go through, how do you do it? How do you do this? And then at the end, we ask you, oh, how are you feeling? Are you feeling any better? If you're feeling better, you might want to try some wheat and see if it makes you feel bad. Because if it does, and immediately, and it will be within 24 hours, then perhaps wheat is a problem to you, and you should stay away from it. Because, of course, not everybody is going to have this. But what we're seeing is that there's more and more people with it.
What percent?
Unlike like having an issue with wheat. Then if they're not feeling brilliant, we look at other foods as well. Because I could have done a whole documentary on the dairy industry. So we look at the dairy. So we do look at other foods and we go, well, how about we eliminate them for a short amount of time, and let's look at the best quality that we can buy. And we do that with wheat as well. If you are going to go back to wheat, what's the best quality that you can buy, and where do you get it? And how do I buy a wheat that's a traditional wheat and is grown the old-fashioned way without glyphosate, without chemicals?
Right.
Yeah.
What percentage of people do suffer from wheat?
Well, we do know that with autoimmune diseases that they've increased by 17%. We also have heart disease increasing. We have type 2 diabetes increasing. We know that the sugar within the wheat, which is called fructan, which divides into fructose, could cause problems for type 2 diabetes. So when we add all of this up, and when we start to realize that there are more and more diseases associated with a leaky gut, which could have started with gluten, or associated with gluten, the protein itself that passes through the gut into the blood, which it shouldn't, we could be looking at 50% plus of people that now have problems with wheat and don't even know they have a problem with wheat. So it could be an autoimmune disease.
You have a research that 50%, that's a big number.
It is a huge number. Like,
where's the research that you have that backs that up? Where do you get that from?
Well, what we do is that we look at what wheat is affecting now. So let's look at the autoimmune diseases in America at the moment. We know that those that are diagnosed, and remember that not everybody will be diagnosed, but those that are diagnosed is 17%.
What are the list of autoimmune diseases?
The list is endless, it seems. It seems we've realised that the body starts attacking itself with autoimmune diseases. They include things like Hashimoto's, Graves', Artisan, MS, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes. And when you see the rise in these diseases over the last probably 20 years, 2 decades, and we look at that, and we look at how gluten is associated with autoimmune disease through a molecular mimicry. That's one way. There are other ways, but one of them is molecular mimicry. So let me explain molecular mimicry. So let's say gluten has the amino acid chain AABBC. So that's not been broken down into its separate A's, its B's, and its C's. It's still in that form. It passes through a leaky gut or an intestinal wall that has been compromised, passes through it and goes into the blood system. When it's in the blood system, it's seen as an enemy because it shouldn't be in there. So there's a cell-activated immune response, which is just a quick response to get rid of it. But if you eat it for breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, decade after decade after decade, you have a compromised gut, the body then goes, this is worldwide or, body-wide. So it creates a Th2 response, which then goes, well, where can I see this protein in the body that I can kill? So it might find it in the thyroid, might find it in the pancreas, in the beta cells, it might find it in the brain, it may find it in your joints, it may find it in any part of your body, the nervous system. And then it starts to attack that system because it thinks it's the enemy through molecular mimicry. So it can do this with a virus. We've noted with type 1 diabetes that I think it's rotavirus is one that it will do molecular mimicry in. And if someone has rotavirus, the likelihood of them getting type 1 diabetes is far greater. So we're beginning to realize that this is what happens.
Wow. Okay, so autoimmune, cardiac, what about cardiac?
So one of the things that Dr. Terry Walls talks about is that, the arteriosclerosis could be classified as an autoimmune disease. I actually had dinner with Terry last night. I'm here at a medical function, and she's one of the speakers. And, she talks about the fact that arteriosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries, where calcium starts to build up in our arteries, is also an autoimmune disease, and that gluten could affect it. She actually says that in the film.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And we know type 2 diabetes, it could be the fructose that is causing that in type 2 diabetes. So, all we have to do is add up the autoimmune diseases, the heart diseases, the type 2 diabetes, and you'll notice that that's, a fair percentage of the population these days.
Yeah.
And most people don't, they'll have their bypass surgery. They won't be told about diet. And they'll never change. And so they put on statin drugs because it's been indicated to help people who have had a heart attack and who are not prepared to change their lifestyle. So statin drugs are what they put on, as well as Plavix, and I think it's 5 medications, one for blood pressure, beta blockers. So they're all put on a bunch of medications.
We could be affecting high blood pressure too.
High blood pressure, definitely, because arteriosclerosis is one reason why, the pressure in the arteries is increasing.
Okay. So, I did this interview with you last week, and then I was telling some people about it. And one of the things that I found that this was very salient for me was the fact that, and we've kind of gotten into it, talking about the old grains, but there's this, most of the wheat that we eat now, that most of humanity eats now, is not the old grain. It's a new hybrid that was created a couple decades ago. So talk about the history of modern wheat and how it relates to the old wheat. I mean, you
Yeah.
started that story and we kind of got off track. So let's.
Yeah, we did. So the old wheat was very tall. In a wind, it would fall over. It didn't have a lot of grains in it. It was hard to harvest. It had to be manually harvested, or they started to have the old-fashioned harvesters. But what happened was that there were countries starving, so Pakistan and India, and they started to manipulate the wheat to, number one, create a wheat that was easier to harvest, which meant that the stalk needed to be shorter and we needed more grain because we needed a higher yield. And so Norman Borlaug worked for the Corn and Wheat Board, and he started to manipulate wheat from different countries around the world that may have not necessarily hybridized naturally together. And he created a new wheat around late 1970s and started to be grown by the 1980s, especially in Australia it was, called Triticum estivum. And yes, it's different. The gluten's on different genes. There's more gluten because we want a lighter loaf of bread, so there's more gluten. But Triticum estivum is that new grain. So it's a shorter stalk, more grain, higher yield, easier to harvest. And they called this, when they planted it in India and Pakistan, they called it the Green Revolution. But the Green Revolution had nothing green about it. It had a lot to do with chemicals being used because they were huge monocultures that were likely to be infestated with either weeds or insects or something that was going to destroy it, or bacteria, whatever it was. So many chemicals were used on this land that had the monocultures on it, especially the wheat grain, and especially through India and Pakistan. And if you talk to Vandana Shiva, who's also in the film, she talks about the devastation of Punjab, which is where this all started in India. And she also talks about
Devastation of Punjab. What's that mean?
Punjab is a province in India.
I know, but what do you mean, the devastation of Punjab?
Oh, so all of the varieties of foods that they had were destroyed, number one. A lot of chemicals were sprayed. There was a lot of sickness. There's so much cancer in Punjab that there is the Punjab cancer train that goes from the Punjab province to the next province because all the hospitals are filled. So she and she talks about the food that the people ate was all starch-based. There was no variety. There was no other plants that were being grown because everything had wheat on it. So that was, that was the beginning of the Green Revolution. Then I remember when it, I don't remember, but I know that it came to Australia in the 80s because I was unaware of what was happening to wheat in the 80s. But I've spoken to farmers in Australia who have said they remember when the wheat grain changed. And they had two weeds that they had to contend with during that time. But when the new wheat grain came, they had 7 weeds to contend with. And this farmer that I spoke to said he believes the weeds came in with the grain. And the only chemicals that would get rid of these weeds were the chemicals that were being made by the seeds, the seed manufacturers. So, that's one thing that happened. The other thing that that I'm not sure I talked about with you, and I don't talk about on the film, is that there's a new wheat being produced at the moment called Clearfield wheat. And Clearfield wheat is being experimented in the US at the moment to see how well it performs. So it's not genetically modified, it's hybridized. They use a chemical in order to hybridize it. This chemical is very toxic to human cells, but I don't know enough about Clearfield wheat, but for people who want to look it up, just look up Clearfield wheat. It's made by the company BASF.
BASF.
BASF, yeah.
Wasn't that just acquired by Monsanto?
Either that or Monsanto was bought out by them. I can't remember.
The other, yeah, they're tied together now.
Yeah, very much. See, You know, they basically don't want to allow us to have our seeds anymore. Farmers in America at the moment have to buy seeds all the time. They can't save seeds. And so it becomes very expensive, and their chemicals are huge. I was speaking to a farmer in Australia who grows wheat. Every year their chemical expense is $700,000. $700,000. It's like, it's just outrageous that we have to grow our foods like this. No wonder, you know, and it's a very subsidized grain, by the way, wheat. So you might think it's a cheap commodity, but it's not to the environment, to your body, and to the human race, and to the environment, and to, you know, to the earth.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this part of the interview up short. Then we're going to hop to the second half, and there's some really interesting information in there. A quick tip, some quick tips. What are 3 steps that people can do to start eliminating wheat from their diet, besides just not eating bread and rolls and cake?
Yeah.
And breadcrumbs. I realized that breaded stuff like mozzarella sticks and chicken, that's covered with the stuff too.
Yeah. I think number 1 is becoming aware. So write down your diet. Highlight how many times you eat wheat. Just get your highlighter and highlight it down and figure out how many times you eat wheat. So number 1 is being aware. Second is, where can I eliminate it where I don't really need it? So if it's breakfast cereals, and you can eliminate that really easy, and you enjoy eggs for breakfast, eggs and I give you lots of recipes in the 6-week no wheat recipe book, you know, try a different breakfast. If it's, you notice you're eating a lot of bread and it's sandwiches, try a different lunch. Don't eat sandwiches. And if you have meat and veg for dinner, but you're having a bread roll, just leave the bread roll out. And that's a really good start. But I find that the third step is to eliminate it completely for that 6-week period, because that is when you will notice whether it is really affecting you or not. And whether you can be diagnosed or not with celiac or wheat allergy or an autoimmune disease doesn't matter. Just give it a go. You're not going to die of a deficiency of it in 6 weeks. I can guarantee it. In actual fact,
pizza. Yeah, and one thing we did mention in the other conversation was that both wheat and gluten and cheese both are converted into opioid products in our guts.
Yes.
So they're both extremely addicting, and that's why kids eat them so much, and that's why I eat so much pizza. Yeah.
And that's the thing, is that when you ask somebody to give it up, they do have fear in their face. They do go, well, what am I going to eat now? You know, they don't know anything different than their breakfast cereals, their crackers, their breads, their pastas, their sandwiches, and they don't know anything different.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. There's a second half of this that lots of good information, including why it's not so easy to just start eating meat, because meat has problems of its own related to wheat and grains, which you can probably figure out, but we'll make it clear in the second half of the show. So give us your website again and your details.
Yeah, sure. So the website about the wheat is whatswithwheat.com with an S, so What's With Wheat. But if you want to go and see what I do, I have a website called changinghabits.com.au. That's to say that it's in Australia. If you go to .com, you'll end up at a nappy place, so don't go there. Go to .com.au.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Great.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.